A gold digger married my dad, and now she's acting like she's already entitled to his entire estate. What she doesn't realize is that the property she thinks she's taking over doesn't actually belong to him at all. So let me explain what's going on. My dad is preparing to move into hospice soon, and honestly, things have been chaotic for quite some time. Sure, we all saw this coming eventually, but knowing it was coming never made the situation any easier to deal with. Here's the part that makes everything even stranger. The house where he's been living with his wife Laura and her two daughters, Megan and Chloe, technically isn't his place. That house actually belongs to me. I bought it years ago, even though you'd never guess that based on how they've been acting lately. But I'm getting a little ahead of the story here, so let me back up for a moment. About 7 years ago, my dad hit a really rough patch after my mom passed away. They had been married for more than 30 years. And when she died, it completely destroyed him. It was painful for all of us, of course, but my dad took it especially hard. Not long after losing her, he also lost his job, and before long he couldn't keep up with the rent on their apartment. Eventually he was evicted, and it felt like his entire life was falling apart piece by piece. Everything seemed to collapse at the same time, and he didn't really have anyone else to rely on. At that point, I was the only person he could turn to for help. Since I was the only one in a position to do something about it, I decided to step up and buy him a house. It wasn't anything extravagant or fancy, just a small, simple place in a quiet, older neighborhood where things were peaceful. The house wasn't impressive or luxurious by any means, but it was safe and comfortable. More importantly than anything else, it meant my dad finally had a stable roof over his head when he desperately needed one. He also had his dog, Max, and honestly that dog meant the world to him. In a lot of ways, Max was the last living connection he still had to my mom. That dog wasn't just some random pet in the house. To us, Max was family. Having Max around made the whole situation a little easier for my dad to handle. For the first couple of years after that, things actually went pretty well. My dad slowly started healing, little by little, and that house became something like his personal sanctuary. He never fully recovered from losing my mom, but he managed to get back on his feet as best as anyone could after something like that. And through it all, Max stayed right there beside him, always keeping him company. I made it a habit to visit every single weekend, and before long it turned into our regular routine. Every time I pulled into the driveway, Max would start wagging his tail like crazy the moment he saw me. Most weekends we'd hang out in the backyard, grilling burgers, talking about life, and just trying to enjoy the little moments again after everything we had gone through. Then Laura showed up. She and my dad met through a group of mutual friends, and before I even had time to process it, they ended up getting married. I didn't really have a problem with it. Honestly, if being with Laura helped my dad feel happier again, then I was glad for him. First, Laura seemed perfectly fine. She was always polite whenever we talked. She smiled a lot, and she acted like she genuinely cared about my dad. So when my dad told me she was planning to move into the house, I didn't object. At the end of the day, it was his life. Even though the house technically belonged to me, I figured as long as he was happy, that was what really mattered. But that's when things started getting a little strange. First, it was just Laura moving in, which seemed normal enough. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, her daughter Megan showed up with a bunch of bags and boxes like she was planning to live there too. Now Megan wasn't some teenager who needed somewhere to stay for a few days. She was already in her late 20s, a fully grown adult. And it quickly became clear that she wasn't just visiting. She had moved in for good. I kept my mouth shut about it because I didn't want to interfere in my dad's life. Still, I couldn't help thinking the whole situation felt a little unusual. After a few months passed, I started noticing little changes every time I came over. More and more of Laura's things were scattered around the house. The place that used to feel like my dad's home slowly started to feel like it belonged more to her. I tried not to dwell on it too much. I just kept telling myself that if my dad was happy, then maybe it was best to leave things alone. But just when I thought the house couldn't possibly get any more crowded, Laura's younger daughter Chloe moved in too. Now the house was packed. Laura, Megan, Chloe, and my dad were all living there together under the same roof. You can probably imagine how that turned out. First, I tried to ignore it. Sure, it was strange watching Laura and her daughters slowly take over the place that used to be my dad's home, but I didn't feel like it was my place to interfere. I wasn't about to start telling my dad how he should live his life. But over time, the situation started getting worse. The atmosphere in the house changed completely. Before long, it felt like my dad's opinion didn't matter much anymore. Everything started revolving around what Laura and her daughters wanted. Things were already heading downhill with Laura and her girls gradually taking control of the house. Then, Just when I thought the situation couldn't get any more irritating, the whole drama with Max happened. Let me make one thing clear about Max. That dog wasn't just a pet to us. Max was part of the family. My mom absolutely adored that dog and treated him like he was her baby. After she passed away, Max became a kind of emotional support for my dad. In many ways, Max was the one thing that helped keep him grounded after everything he had gone through. I know not everyone understands that kind of bond. But if you've ever had a dog you truly loved, then you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. So you can imagine how angry it made me when Chloe, Laura's youngest daughter, started complaining about Max seriously. Out of all things to complain about, Max was old, gentle, and completely harmless. Most of the day he spent either sleeping or lazily chasing his own tail when he wasn't too tired. But one day Chloe suddenly announced that Max made her feel uncomfortable. She actually claimed she didn't feel safe with him in the house. Now I try not to dismiss people's fears too quickly. But come on. We're talking about Max here, not some wild animal. The dog was 13 years old, could barely climb the stairs without stopping halfway to catch his breath, and honestly posed about as much danger as a pillow. At first, I didn't take her complaints seriously. I figured she was just being overly dramatic. But of course Laura jumped right in and started backing her up. Suddenly it turned into this whole big issue. Laura even started suggesting that maybe it was time for Max to find another home. The way she talked about it made it sound like he was some old piece of furniture that needed to be thrown away. That was the moment I finally hit my limit. I could see how much stress this situation was putting on my dad. They weren't just asking him to give up a dog. They were basically asking him to give up the last real connection he still had to my mom. Watching that unfold honestly broke my heart. But at the same time, there wasn't much I could do. I wasn't living in the house, and by that point Laura had practically taken control of every decision being made there. I could tell my dad didn't want to give Max up. But he was exhausted. Between his health problems and all the tension in the house, he just didn't have the energy left to fight back. So eventually I stepped in. I told my dad straight out that Max could come live with me. There was no way I was going to sit back and let Laura or her daughters pressure him into giving up that dog. My dad looked relieved when I said it, but I could still tell it hurt him. He loved Max and never wanted to part with him. But he also knew that letting Max stay with me was probably the only way to stop the constant arguing at home. Laura acted like she was doing my dad some huge favor by allowing me to take Max. But I wasn't fooled for a second. This situation was never really about the dog. It was about control. Laura and her daughters wanted to be the ones making all the decisions, and pushing Max out was just another way to sideline my dad in his own home. From that point on, whenever I came over to visit, I started bringing Max along with me. And every single time, they acted like I had just walked in with a dangerous wild animal. Megan and Chloe would literally behave as if Max might attack them at any moment. The very first time I brought him back after he moved in with me, Chloe actually screamed the second she saw him. You'd think she had never seen the dog before in her life, even though she had lived in the same house with him for years. Laura tried to pretend everything was normal, but I could see her rolling her eyes every time I walked through the door with Max happily trotting behind me. The whole situation was honestly ridiculous. Max would just stroll inside wagging his little tail, barely paying any attention to them at all. Meanwhile, they stood there complaining nonstop about how terrifying he supposedly was. I'd sit out back with my dad the same way we always had, just relaxing in the yard, while Max stretched out in the grass beside us, minding his own business. And still, without fail, Chloe or Megan would peek through the window, shoot us this disgusted look, and hurry away like they were dodging some dangerous attack dog. Honestly, I think the real reason they hated seeing Max around was because he reminded them that the house wasn't really theirs. Max had been part of my dad's life for years, and before that he'd been part of my mom's life too. No matter how hard Laura and her daughters tried to take over everything, Max was living proof that they hadn't completely pushed my dad out yet. Then one day, Laura finally said the thing I'd been expecting for a while. She asked me if I could stop bringing Max over to the house. The moment those words left her mouth, my blood started boiling. Why? I asked her straight up. Max isn't doing anything. The dog just lays there. She tried to soften it, acting all polite about it. Laura said Chloe still felt uncomfortable around him, and that it would just be easier for everyone if Max stopped coming over. But I wasn't fooled for a second. I could see exactly what was going on. This wasn't really about the dog at all. It was about control. Little by little, Laura and her daughters had been chipping away at everything that mattered to my dad. Now they wanted to remove the last thing tying him to the life he had before they showed up. I was furious, But at the same time, I didn't want to make things worse for my dad. He was already sick, and the last thing he needed was more stress because of some argument. So I looked Laura right in the eye and told her plainly, Max stays. He's not bothering anybody. And if you don't like it, then just stay inside when I'm here. She definitely didn't appreciate hearing that. Not even a little. But I wasn't about to back down. I could tell she wanted to push the issue further, but I made it clear I wasn't going to give her the opportunity. From that point on, whenever I came by to visit, Max came with me. And honestly, I didn't care what Laura or her daughters thought about it. My dad deserved at least that much. After that, though, the tension inside that house got even worse. It felt like Laura and her girls were just sitting around waiting for the day my dad wouldn't be there anymore so they could finally take over everything. I could see it in the way they treated him. They acted like he was just some old guy taking up space. But as long as Max and I kept showing up, they couldn't completely erase him from the picture. Now that my dad is about to go into hospice, I can practically see what they're thinking. They're convinced the house will become theirs once he's gone. They're already acting like everything will belong to them. But they're going to be in for a pretty big surprise. That house still belongs to me. And Max? Well, that dog is probably going to outlast every one of them. With my dad heading into hospice soon, I knew the clock was ticking. If I wanted to say goodbye properly, I couldn't keep putting it off. It was something I had been dreading for a long time, but eventually you reach a point where you have to face it. My dad's health had gotten worse, and I needed to see him, especially since Max had been living with me ever since Laura and her daughters basically pushed him out of that house. I decided I wanted to bring Max with me so my dad could see him one more time. I figured they deserved that moment together before everything started going downhill. When I arrived at the house, Laura, Megan, and Chloe were already inside. The second I stepped through the door with Max walking beside me, the atmosphere in the room instantly changed. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and everyone suddenly goes quiet? Yeah, it was exactly like that. The mood was tense, but honestly, I didn't care. I wasn't there for them. I was there to see my dad. Megan was the first one to open her mouth. She glanced down at Max, scrunched up her nose and said, "Oh great! He brought that stupid dog again." She didn't even bother hiding her attitude. The way she talked, you'd think Max was some wild animal. In reality, the poor dog was so old at that point he barely moved unless someone tempted him with a treat. But Megan kept acting like he was about to tear the place apart. I took a slow breath and chose to ignore her. Even though I could feel my temper rising, I wasn't about to start a fight right then. All I said was, "I'm here to see Dad." And I headed straight toward his room. As I walked past them, I heard Laura whisper something to Chloe under her breath. I didn't catch the whole thing. Probably some snide little remark about me or Max. But honestly, I didn't have the energy to deal with their nonsense. When I stepped into my dad's room, I saw him lying in bed. He looked weak and frail, but he was still awake. The moment he noticed me standing there, his face lit up. Then Max trotted into the room behind me, wagging his tail like crazy. For the first time in weeks, my dad actually smiled. Right then it hit me just how much he had missed that dog. Max tried climbing onto the bed, which was honestly a bit of a challenge for him at his age. But somehow he managed it. Once he made it up there, he curled up right next to my dad like nothing had changed. My dad reached over and scratched behind Max's ears, just like he used to do every day. For a few minutes it felt like everything was normal again. I could see how much comfort it gave my dad just having Max there beside him. At first, neither of us said much. It was one of those quiet moments where words really aren't necessary. I just sat there next to him with Max lying between us, and we stayed like that for a while. I could tell my dad was weaker than the last time I had seen him. Seeing him like that hurt more than I expected. But at the same time, there was a strange kind of relief. At least for those few minutes, he seemed genuinely happy. After a little while, my dad finally spoke. "I've really missed this old guy," he said softly, his voice shaky but still warm. "It's good seeing him again." I nodded because I knew if I tried to speak, my voice would probably crack. I didn't want him to see how emotional I was getting. Instead, I just reached over and gently patted Max on the head. We spent a little time talking about simple things. Old memories. Stories about Max moments from back when my mom was still alive. It felt comforting. But there was also a sadness hanging over everything. The whole time, one thought kept running through my mind. This might be the last time I ever see my dad like this. Awake, present, still himself. Even when you know something like that is coming, it's incredibly hard to accept. And of course, just when things felt peaceful for a moment, Laura had to ruin it. I was getting ready to leave when she suddenly walked into the room without even knocking. Her eyes immediately landed on Max curled up on the bed next to my dad. Her expression turned irritated right away. "I thought I told you not to bring that dog here," she said, crossing her arms and glaring at me like I'd done something terrible. I could feel the anger rising again, but I kept my voice calm. "Max isn't bothering anyone," I said evenly. "He's here to say goodbye to Dad." Then I added, "You got a problem with that?" Chloe had followed Laura into the room and was standing behind her. "Good riddance," she muttered loudly enough for me to hear. "I'm glad we won't have to deal with him after this." That was the moment I finally snapped. I stood up, doing my best to stay composed, even though it wasn't easy. "You know what?" I said firmly. "I don't care what you think about Max. He's family, and he's staying here as long as I'm here. If you don't like it, that's just too bad." Laura looked like she was about to argue back. But before she could say anything else, my dad quietly spoke up. "It's fine," he said softly. "Just let them be." My dad spoke quietly, but there was enough firmness in his tone that Laura didn't try to argue with him anymore. After that, I stuck around for a little while longer so my dad and Max could spend some more time together. But eventually I had to head out. Deep down, I knew that was probably the last time I'd ever bring Max over there. So I wanted the visit to end on a good note. As I was leaving, I walked past the living room where Megan was sitting on the couch, glued to her phone. She barely bothered to glance up as I passed by. But right as I reached the door, she muttered, "I can't wait until we never have to see that dog again." I froze for a moment, stopped walking, and slowly turned around to look at her. For a second, I just stood there staring, trying to decide whether it was even worth responding. Finally, I simply said, "You won't have to." Then I walked out. At that point, I had no interest in wasting any more of my time or energy on them. During the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about how wrong everything felt. And it wasn't just about Max anymore. It was about the whole situation. The house that used to belong to my dad had somehow turned into something completely different. Laura and her daughters had basically taken over the place. And the worst part was that they didn't even seem to care about what my dad was going through. Honestly, it felt like they were just waiting around for him to die so they could move on with their plans. But the joke was going to be on them. That house wasn't theirs. And when the time came, they were going to find that out the hard way. A few days after that visit, my dad's condition got worse much faster than any of us expected. Instead of moving into hospice the following week as planned, he was transferred almost immediately. Everything suddenly felt like it was happening at once. Update 1. After that last visit with my dad, I realized something had to change. I couldn't keep walking on eggshells around Laura and her daughters while they acted like they owned the place and I just stood by quietly. My dad's health wasn't improving, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before he was gone. Once that happened, I had no doubt Laura and her daughters would assume they could keep living there forever, rent-free, just like they had been doing for years. And there was no way I was going to let that continue. Still, instead of immediately dropping the big reveal that the house actually belonged to me, I decided to approach things gradually. The first step was seeing how they'd react to the idea of paying rent. Maybe, just maybe, they'd surprise me and show a little responsibility. But honestly, I wasn't expecting much. A few days after that emotional visit with my dad, I went back to the house. When I walked in, the three of them, Laura, Megan, and Chloe, were all sitting in the living room like they didn't have a single worry in the world. They were watching some trashy reality show on TV and laughing at whatever ridiculous drama was happening on the screen. Seeing that honestly made my blood boil. My dad was already in hospice by then, and meanwhile they were acting like everything was perfectly normal. I took a slow breath to calm myself and stepped into the room. Megan glanced up for a second, barely acknowledging my presence. Laura grabbed the remote and paused the show, clearly annoyed that I had interrupted their little entertainment session. "Can we talk for a minute?" I asked, doing my best to keep my voice steady. Even though I was already frustrated, I didn't want to start things off aggressively. Laura raised one eyebrow. "About what?" she asked. "About what's going to happen after my dad passes," I replied. The atmosphere in the room changed immediately. The laughter disappeared, and all three of them turned their attention to me. Good. They needed to hear this. "I've been thinking a lot about the house," I continued. "Specifically about rent." The word rent hung in the air like a ticking time bomb. Chloe let out a sharp laugh. "Rent? What are you even talking about?" I ignored her tone and kept going. "After Dad passes away, things are going to change," I said calmly. If you want to keep living here, you'll need to start paying rent. I've already spoken to a lawyer, and we've worked out a reasonable amount based on the house's market value. Chloe stared at me like I had personally insulted her. Megan straightened up, looking ready to fire off some sarcastic comment. But Laura spoke first. "Hold on a second," she said, narrowing her eyes at me. "Why would we need to pay rent? Robert wanted us to stay here." I nodded slowly, keeping my voice calm. "I understand that," I said. "But I've been covering the expenses for this house for years now, and that can't continue after he's gone. You've had a pretty good situation here for a long time, but it's going to have to change. You can either start paying rent, or you'll need to find another place to live." The room fell completely silent. I could practically see Laura trying to process what I just said. Megan and Chloe looked totally stunned, like the idea of paying rent had never even crossed their minds. Of course it hadn't. Why would it? They'd been living there for free the entire time. Finally, Laura spoke again, and her tone had turned sharp. "This is Robert's house," she snapped. "He wanted us to stay here. You're not seriously going to charge us rent after everything we've done for him." I clenched my jaw but forced myself to stay calm. "Look," I said, "I'm not trying to make this harder than it has to be. But the reality is someone has to cover the costs of this house, and that's not going to be me anymore. I've taken care of everything up until now, but that won't continue once Dad's gone. You can either start paying rent, or you'll need to move out. Those are the options." Megan finally jumped in, her face flushed with anger. "That's unbelievable," she snapped. "We've lived here for years, and now you're trying to profit off of us? What kind of person does that to their own family?" I sighed, feeling my patience starting to wear thin. "I'm not trying to profit off anyone," I told her. "I'm just trying to make sure things are handled fairly. You've already had plenty of time living here, and I'm still giving you more. 3 months after Dad passes. 3 months to figure out what you're going to do. That's more than fair." Chloe folded her arms across her chest and glared at me. "So what, you're just going to kick us out if we don't pay?" "I'd rather it didn't come to that," I said, meeting her stare. "But yes, if you won't pay rent, then you'll have to move out. I can't keep paying the bills for you." At that point Laura stood up, clearly trying to shift into full victim mode. "I can't believe you do this to us after everything we've done for Robert," she said dramatically. "After everything we've done for this family. You're really just going to throw us out like we don't matter?" I shook my head slowly. "I'm not throwing anyone out," I told her. "I'm giving you choices. But things are going to change, and you need to start preparing for that. You've got 3 months. That's already more generous than most people would be." I could see Megan gearing up to argue again, but I was done talking. I had said everything I needed to say. There was no point standing there all day while they complained and tried to guilt-trip me. So before they could pile on with more arguments, I turned around and headed for the door. As I walked outside, I could still hear them talking inside the house. They were probably already trying to figure out how to get around this, how to keep living there without paying anything. But I wasn't going to change my mind. I had laid out their options clearly: pay rent or move out. And in 3 months they were going to have to face reality. What they didn't realize yet was that the house wasn't even my dad's to give them in the first place. Update 2. Things moved faster than I expected. One day my dad was still holding on. The next day he was gone. Even though I had been preparing myself for that moment, it still hit me like a ton of bricks. Watching him slip away like that wasn't easy. But at least there was one small comfort. I knew he was finally at peace. The suffering he had been dealing with for so long was finally over. After the funeral was over, though, I still had to deal with everything that came afterward. And honestly, it didn't surprise me at all that Laura and her daughters, Megan and Chloe, were acting like nothing had really changed. If anything, it almost felt like they had been waiting for this moment. Like now that my dad was gone, everything was finally falling into place for them. The way they carried themselves made it seem like they were ready to fully take over the house now that he wasn't around anymore. But the truth was, they had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. I gave things a few days after the funeral so the dust could settle a little. But I wasn't planning to wait around forever. The sooner I dealt with the situation, the better. They were probably assuming they'd be able to stay in that house indefinitely without paying a dime. But I had a very different plan in mind. So a few days later, I drove over to the house. When I walked inside, I found Laura sitting in the living room with Megan and Chloe, lounging around like they owned the place. They were laughing at something on TV, completely carefree. Meanwhile, my dad had only just passed away. There was no sign of grief, no sadness, nothing. They were just going on with their lives like it was any other ordinary day. I stood in the doorway for a moment, quietly watching them. Honestly, the whole scene felt surreal. How could they possibly be so unaffected by everything that had just happened? My dad had literally just died, and yet there they were acting like nothing had changed. Eventually, I cleared my throat and stepped into the room. Laura looked over at me but didn't say a word. Megan and Chloe stayed silent too. They just stared at me, waiting. I figured they probably assumed I had come by to discuss something about the funeral or arrangements or whatever. I took a slow breath before speaking. "We need to talk about the house," I said. Laura frowned, clearly confused. "What do you mean?" she asked. "We already talked about that. We're staying here, just like Robert wanted." And there it was, that entitlement I had been expecting. I felt my anger rising, but I kept it under control. I wasn't about to let them push my buttons. "No," I said calmly, shaking my head. "We haven't talked about this. You think you're staying here, but that's not how it's going to work. This house doesn't belong to my dad. It belongs to me. I bought it for him after my mom passed away, and now that he's gone, it goes back to me." The entire room went silent. Laura looked stunned, like she had no clue what I was talking about. She blinked several times before finally speaking. "What are you talking about?" she asked. "Robert never told me that. This is our home." I almost laughed. "Well, he didn't need to tell you," I said. "This house was never his to give away. I bought it so he'd have somewhere to live after he lost his apartment. But the property has always been in my name. And now that he's gone, it's time for you to move on too." Megan shot up from the couch, her face red with anger. "You can't just throw us out like that," she snapped. "We've lived here for years. This is our home now." I turned toward her and answered calmly. "No, it isn't. You've been living here rent-free, and I allowed it because of my dad. But now that he's gone, that arrangement is over. You either start paying rent or you leave. You've got 3 months to figure it out." All three of them looked completely stunned. Laura's face twisted like she might cry, but instead she turned that emotion into anger. "You can't do this to us," she said. "Robert wanted us to stay here." "I'm sorry," I replied, even though I didn't really feel sorry at all. "But that's not how things work. Legally, this house belongs to me, and I'm not letting you stay here without paying for it. You've been taking advantage of my dad for years, and I'm done allowing that." Laura tried to keep arguing, but I had already stopped paying attention. The tension in the room was thick, but I wasn't backing down. This house was mine, and I had every right to make the decision I was making. "I've already talked to my lawyer," I added, pulling out the documents. "If you don't believe me, here it is in writing. I own this house, not you, not my dad. You've got 3 months to figure out your next move, and if you're still here after that, I won't hesitate to file an eviction." Chloe sat frozen on the couch, staring at the paperwork with her mouth slightly open. "This can't be happening," she whispered, looking at Laura like she expected reassurance. But Laura didn't have anything to say. She knew exactly what this meant. I could see it in her eyes. She had been counting on this house. She thought she and her daughters would be able to stay there forever without paying anything. Now reality was finally hitting them. "You've got to be kidding me," Megan said, pacing around the room. "After everything we've done for Robert, you're just kicking us out?" I almost laughed again. "Everything you've done?" I said. "You mean disrespecting him, trying to force him to get rid of Max, and treating him like a guest in his own home?" "Yeah. Real generous of you." They all started talking at once, trying to defend themselves. But honestly, I wasn't even listening anymore. I had already heard enough. I was tired of the excuses, tired of the entitlement, tired of the way they had treated my dad. He deserved better than that, and I wasn't about to let them keep acting like they owned the place. "I've said what I came here to say," I told them as I headed toward the door. "You've got 3 months. After that, we'll see what happens." As I walked out of the house, I could still hear them arguing behind me, probably trying to figure out what they were going to do next. But that wasn't my problem anymore. They had spent years living off my dad, and off me. Now it was time for them to deal with the consequences. As I stepped outside, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I knew the situation wouldn't be simple, but I also knew I was doing the right thing. For far too long, I had allowed them to take advantage of everything. Now it was time to reclaim what was mine. That house never belonged to them. Not then. Not now. And before long, they were going to be out of my life for good. Update 3. After I told Laura and her daughters that they either had to start paying rent or move out, I honestly thought that would be the end of the story. I mean, what else could they possibly do? I had all the legal paperwork showing I owned the house. The law was clearly on my side, and I had even given them plenty of time to figure out their next move. 3 months seemed more than fair, but apparently Laura didn't see it that way, because, believe it or not, she decided to sue me. Yeah, Laura actually hired a lawyer and filed a lawsuit claiming she had a legal right to stay in the house. Her argument was that she was my dad's wife and that he had supposedly promised the house to her after he died. When I first heard about it, I couldn't help but laugh. One afternoon while I was at work, I got served with the court paperwork. My first thought was, you've got to be kidding me. I honestly couldn't believe she was serious. What was she thinking? She knew perfectly well that I owned the property. I had already shown her the documents. I had explained everything calmly, and I even gave her far more time than most people would have to get her life sorted out. But apparently that still wasn't good enough. Instead, she decided to take the whole thing to court and somehow convince herself she could win. Now personally, I've never been a fan of going to court. Going through a lawsuit is never fun. The whole process is stressful, time-consuming, and honestly just a giant headache. But despite all that, I wasn't actually worried about the outcome. I already had a solid lawyer ready to handle everything, and I knew we had more than enough evidence to shut Laura's case down before it even really started. The first thing I did after getting the papers was call my lawyer. He stayed completely calm about the situation, which I guess makes sense since he deals with this kind of thing all the time. After he reviewed the documents Laura had filed, he basically shrugged and said, "Yeah, this isn't going anywhere." Then he added, "They don't have a leg to stand on." Even hearing that, though, I was still irritated that I had to deal with it at all. I mean, seriously, they had already spent years living in my house without paying a dime. What more could they possibly want? Anyway, the legal process dragged on for a couple of months. During that time, Laura kept making all kinds of claims about how my dad had supposedly promised the house to her. Of course, she didn't have a single piece of paperwork to prove any of it. Not a will, not a written agreement, nothing. Instead, she tried leaning heavily on the grieving widow angle. She acted like I was some heartless villain throwing her out of the home she shared with my dad. But the truth was simple. Legally speaking, she had absolutely no claim to that house. During the hearings, I had to sit there and listen while her lawyer tried to build this whole story about how Laura and my dad had planned to leave the house to her after he died. He went on about how much she had supposedly invested in turning the place into their home. Yeah, right. What her lawyer conveniently left out was how Laura and her daughters had basically taken over the house. They treated my dad like he was just another guest living there. And let's not forget how they tried to force him to get rid of Max. But naturally, none of that made it into their story. For the most part, I kept my cool during the hearings. I could already tell the judge wasn't buying their narrative. And my lawyer did an excellent job dismantling every argument they tried to make. We came prepared with all the documentation. The title deed showing the house was in my name. Bank records proving I had paid for it. All the paperwork you could possibly need. So every time Laura's side tried bringing up some supposed promise my dad made, we responded with hard evidence. One of the more ridiculous moments happened when Laura suddenly claimed she had made improvements to the house. According to her, she deserved compensation for all the work she had supposedly done. Improvements. I remember thinking, the house looked exactly the same as it did when I bought it. If anything, it was actually in worse shape because they hadn't taken proper care of it. My lawyer pointed that out right away, and the judge shut that argument down almost instantly. As if that wasn't enough, Laura's daughters, Megan and Chloe, actually showed up to court too, and they had the nerve to act like they were victims in the whole situation. At one point Megan started talking about how they had lived there for years and how the house felt like their home. Meanwhile, I was sitting there thinking, you've been living there for free this whole time and now you're acting like I owe you something? I wanted to respond so badly, but my lawyer shot me that look that clearly said, don't say a word. So I stayed quiet. In the end, it didn't take the judge very long to make his decision. He basically confirmed what we already knew from the beginning. Laura had absolutely no legal claim to the property. There was no will, no written agreement, no documentation of any kind suggesting my dad had promised her the house. And since the house legally belonged to me, Laura and her daughters would have to move out. I can't say I was shocked by the ruling. Honestly, it was exactly what I expected. The lawsuit had just been a desperate attempt by them to hold on to something they never had the right to in the first place. The judge gave them one final deadline, 2 weeks to move out. If they didn't leave by then, the eviction process would start. When we walked out of the courtroom afterward, Laura refused to even look at me. She stormed out with Megan and Chloe following behind her. All three of them acted like I had done something terrible to them. But honestly, I didn't feel bad. I had already given them more time and more chances than they deserved. And instead of accepting that, they tried to turn around and sue me. At the end of the day, though, they didn't really have any options left. After the court ruling, they packed up their things and left the house. And that was it. I never heard from any of them again. No phone calls, no messages, nothing. They basically disappeared. And to be honest, that was a huge relief. The whole situation had turned into a nightmare. But now it was finally over. The house was fully back under my control, the way it legally always had been. And I didn't have to deal with their drama anymore. Sure, the process had been long and exhausting. But in the end, everything worked out. I came out on top. And Laura? Well, she lost. It didn't matter what she believed my dad had promised her. In the end, the law is the law. And there was nothing she could do to change that. So yeah, she tried to sue me. And she lost. Now the house is mine. They're gone for good. And honestly, that's all I ever wanted.